I was born in Racine, Wisconsin, which is between Chicago and Milwaukee. It's on Lake Michigan, which is one of its great benefits, where I spent a great deal of my childhood. Went to Catholic schools. In fact, I think 13 years of Catholic schools. In high school, St. Catherine's High School, I had a wonderful nun who taught the art classes, and I think she was just a great inspiration for me. So I think that's where, more than just a childhood drawing, it was her effect on me and her dedication, such dedication to being an artist. My parents were keen on me going to a Catholic college, so I went 2 years near Chicago, Rosary College, and they had sort of an art department, but it was just sort of an art department. So after 2 years there, I convinced my mother that I should go to Madison, even though the priests in my high school were so against those communists in Madison. It was always humorous to hear him rail against the University of Wisconsin, and here I am teaching at the University of Wisconsin. Well, it's interesting, speaking of my work in Italia, one summer session as an undergrad, an artist named Mish Cohn came from the West Coast. He'd originally been from Chicago and taught an etching class. That's, I guess, looking back, that's really the first etching I did, and I really loved it. And it was interesting because he was, in my eyes, a famous artist, and he was here, and this was very thrilling to me to work with him. He was obviously a lovely man. And so that really got me excited about etching when I think back about what was my first introduction to etching, and that was surely it. So for, I guess it was one more year that I was an undergrad, then I continued to do etching. Well, after graduating from college, 2 years here in the majoring in art, a couple of friends and I set off for San Francisco. It was, the Beat generation was really over, but the remnants were still there. So it was an adventure crossing the country and going through orange groves and just coming to California. I did one summer, Stanley William Hayter came to San Francisco because his wife was from there and did a summer class. So I went through the project that Hayter usually does. You start out with a line, a continuous line, and then you break into the line with textures, and then you end up with aquatint. And it was interesting because there were a couple of people who were in the class who had worked with him in Paris, and they were called anciens. Anybody who worked with him before was an ancient and ancien. And they were so enthusiastic, and they did work in the Hayter way and the Krishna Reddy way of multiple layers of inking. But it was a great experience working with him, and what a dynamo he was, what energy he had. But it's interesting that as I was there for a couple of years, and then I went to Europe with my friends for about 6 months and came back, and things were different. I was different. Interestingly enough, there was a show at the San Francisco Museum, a print show, and there were a couple prints of Warringtons in that show. And I looked at those and I thought, that's really interesting. And I decided that I had to go back to school, and I needed more training to be a serious artist. So that made me really decide to go back to Wisconsin. Well, as I mentioned before, I mainly worked in etching. It became my love. Of course, it was a very experimental time, working with these, with photo prints. That was very exciting. And sort of a collage. And interestingly enough, though, in grad school, I was dealing with that very complex prints. When I moved out of that environment, my work became very different. Well, I guess at one point I realized, yeah, I'm from Racine, and there's a building there called the Johnson's Wax building, and I became enamored with Frank Lloyd Wright. The memory of Frank Lloyd Wright was everywhere in Wisconsin at that time. And so I did a print of the Johnson Wax building, and it turned into a portfolio because of Karen Johnson Keeland, who was the granddaughter of the man who started Johnson's Wax in Racine. And that was the focus of Racine, was that building that Wright built for Johnson's Wax. After grad school, I moved to New York And I began working at Bob Blackburn's print shop, which was already famous but became more and more famous. And Bob was a wonderful person and so generous with everybody. And he devoted his life to others. I didn't want to support myself with odd jobs all my life. And so I eventually moved back to Madison and got a studio and kept doing prints and applying for jobs in various places. And actually I started doing a lot of visits to other schools and entering print shows, winning a lot of prizes. And I was having a real printmaker's life, and that was a great life to have. Eventually, Warrington and I, working in the same mediums, we shared a studio. In fact, we rented a big studio. It was a very productive period when we were in that studio. And I also worked for Warrington Printing. I did that for many years. So, it sort of added to my training in etching. Warrington and I had gotten married in 1971, and so we found a house on a farm in the country about 30 miles from Madison and began to make a studio, this studio that I'm sitting in, out of an old machine shed. And that went on and on and on in our lives at this place in Hollandale, Wisconsin, out in the rural area, the sort of the dairy part of this very beautiful area. While working in the art department at the University of California, Berkeley, and in prints was a big change for me. I really could see Madison in a perspective, what a center of printmaking it was and still is. Talking about the Midwest as a center of printmaking, and it's true that when I would go and visit, small colleges, I would see the intensity of the work in printmaking that I didn't see on the West Coast. I think that's been true all along. Thinking about what I have done as far as mediums over my art career, a lot of etching, and then I went through a period where I did enormous wood cuts with power tools. I had a student, it's wonderful to work with grad students. I had a student who was working with power tools, and when I saw that, I've got to do that. So I really segued from etching for like 2 solid years, and all I did was these big wood blocks, multiple layered wood blocks. So I began working on steel, and since I'd come out of wood several years before, I began to bring wood into my work, and my work changed in that it didn't return to being a rectangle. It was a shape. Maybe the rectangle just turned, and maybe pieces of wood sort of crept in and across, and so there would be a lot of different pieces to make the whole thing, and the white of the paper intruded into the print. So that was about the time that I was asked to work at Tandem, and that's the kind of work that I did at Tandem, with lots of different pieces and not just one big rectangle. Sometimes I would spend time going around the studio and finding objects or thinking about, I need the shape of a purse. I'll go upstairs and see what I can find. So it was about objects. It was about the mix of objects and what happened when they kind of collided together. And it was inspired by what I don't know, but it was a period that was, I was very high. It just things came to me. I had come out of a period of working about Saint Teresa of Avila. It was sort of a period of research about this wonderful woman who, in a way, I called the first feminist, because she managed to be a nun and to write and have ideas that nuns weren't supposed to have at the same time. And yet she's a very spiritual person. And so that brought me back to the fact that I was brought up as a Catholic and went to Catholic schools for so many years. I think the ritual items that were part of the church was sort of a great part of that, and that I wanted to look at again, and then sort of St. Teresa and that collided. Sort of toward the end of that period when I was working with St. Teresa, I kind of finished what I needed to say about her, and so then I was kind of segueing to these ritual cloths that I remember so well. And so that's when I started using Xerox. We had a little Xerox machine, and I moved it into my studio, and that was my press for a while. I would take large things and make sectional pieces and then put them together and make cloths, beautiful things that had ritual significance. And actually from that I started doing more installation and actually using actual cloths, and that sort of brought me back again then to the thing about domestic items like the plates that I was talking about earlier. And so I had frames made for these cloths. Some were my grandmother's, some I found, and did installations with that. And then of course the department got a digital printer. I never looked back. I was still doing etchings. I sort of always did. But I really got hooked on that. And then I brought, having worked with these things about China, I brought Mao, and Mao became a big digital factor for me. And then of Nixon's trip to China, which I saw a video, really was a turning point for what I was doing at that point, because I got the video and I went to one of our digital centers. And when I saw that I could see this frame by frame by frame by frame, that was just startling to me. And that's when the Mao installations began, because I could see the differences in expression between Mao from here to here and then Nixon from here to here. The art is such a binding thing. I think, if you didn't have the same work life as your mate, it wouldn't be as interesting, good, and fulfilling.